What's up, my wizards? It's Dev, SBMTG, that place down there. You know, by now we like it a magic. And you know what? You clicked on the first deck tech of the season, lucky you. So let's not waste any time. Let's go ahead and cover the talk of the town. Today, Temur Elementals.
And I'm your favorite Magic Channel's favorite Magic Channel. Best believe that the professor go bananas for my deck techs. I come correct like a porn star, slicing up all these other suckers with my sword Mars.
And we're back. Now, it was no surprise when my patrons picked this deck to be the first deck of the season. Not only is it like the bright, shiny new thing everyone wants to play with, but there's a lot more to it than that. The deck is really difficult to put together in the first place. When you're brewing it, there's a bunch of different directions you can go and a bunch of different ways you can fill your slots. But not only that, once you actually have the thing put together, it's kind of a complicated mess of sequencing and prioritizing plays and figuring out how you're going to play out your turn, not only with the cards in your hand, but all the onboard abilities the deck has access to. There's a lot going on with this thing, so I can understand why you'd want to see the deck teched. So in service of that, I am going to go pretty deep this time around. I want to give you as much information as possible because not only am I going to bring you my brew of the deck, the list that I ended up on and how it plays, all that, but I'm also going to address some other things I've seen some other people try. I am far from the first content creator to get their hands on Temur Elementals this season. I've seen like 10 other people do it already. Because again, it is the most popular deck right now, and everyone's got a different build of it because, again, brewing the deck is fairly complicated. You got a lot of directions to go, and I want to touch on all of those different directions after I bring you my list. But there's a lot to talk about. We got to go ahead and get into it. Now, almost no matter what build you eventually land on, it's a near guarantee that one of the most important cards in that build is going to be Risen Reef. That's why I start with it here, because he is risen. Yes, indeed. The Reef is the beef and the proverbial rug that ties the room together in all of these elemental decks. Now, this leads to some incredibly long turns in this deck, especially if you have the mana to keep pumping into playing more and more elementals. You'll just get elemental after elemental and it'll snowball, and eventually you'll get multiple copies of Risen Reef out, which is intensely broken. Like, the card is unbelievable, and I'd say it's the whole reason to play the deck, especially before the card gets banned. I kid a little bit. I don't think the card's getting banned anytime soon, but the more you play with Risen Reef, the more it feels like an absolute mistake. The card is just unbelievable, and again, it is easily the best reason to play this deck. But another really good reason to play this deck is Omnath. This actually seems like the more obvious reason to play Temur Elementals. This thing can snipe Planeswalkers, kills like 3 to 5 toughness creatures, especially as the game gets late, can kill really big stuff, or it can just be like a lava axe to the face. Sometimes you just want that 4 or 5 extra points of damage to finish a game off, and Omnath can provide you with that too. It's not super great either after or during a sweeper, obviously, but while it is on the table, it will eventually lead to tons of card advantage, and if nothing else, it'll just make either itself or a bunch of your elementals huge, which is, I mean, all of this as you want. I just listed off like 8 things that this card does. Sometimes you won't even be able to appreciate all the value you can get out of an Omnath before the game is over. Now, this is where my list is going to deviate just a little bit for the first time because I'm playing 4 copies of Creeping Trailblazer. You would think this is an auto-include, but it is not. In a lot of people's lists, they've gone an entirely different direction, mostly with their 2 and 3 drop creatures. We'll get on that a little bit later, but I think that Creeping Trailblazer is a very important card for the deck to play, especially if you are going to try to win in combat at some point. Now, the activated ability isn't super important on this. Again, the deck is really hungry, and it's got a lot of different ways to use its mana. So if you're in a position where you have to use this thing's activated ability, you're probably not in the best position because there's a million other ways the deck could want to use its mana than just activate this thing. But that said, the Anthem effect is really important because there's going to be a lot of turns, especially in the late game, where you have more elements than the periodic table on your side of the battlefield, and you just want to get through. So an Anthem effect like this can really do a lot for you if you're going wide, and this deck definitely is once you get to some of the longer turns. Now, one of the biggest decisions in this deck is how you spend your 2-drop slots. You spend them on creatures most of the time, but do you spend them on this, that, or the other? Well, in this case, I have decided to spend 3 2-drop slots on a card that really not everyone is playing. I believe one of the only other people I've seen playing this is Evan Irwin. Amazingly, I don't know why people aren't more clued in on the fact that Stormkin is really, really good right now. Now, Lightning Stormkin might just look like a kind of throwaway creature. 2 mana, 2/2, flying, haste. Those are good keyword abilities and a pretty good rate for the cost, but it doesn't look at first glance like it does much for the deck. But actually, I think it lines up really well in this format right now for a number of reasons, but the big one is Teferi. 3 mana Teferi, specifically. Now, cards like Risen Reef already play really, really well against 3 Fairy. But I want more cards than just that to play well against 3 Fairy. Well, I guess Omnath does too. So you got that going for you. A lot of the cards in this deck are really good against not only 3 mana Teferi, but also 5 mana Teferi. So keep that in mind. But just having another 2-drop haste creature also lines up really well against especially Baby T. Because imagine a turn sequence, and it's not really hard to imagine, it takes place literally all the time, where you play a turn 2 Stormkin, and then, turn 3, they play a Teferi. Well, if they pop Stormkin back to your hand, you're just going to be able to play it again and kill their Teferi next turn. So creatures like this, especially evasive haste creatures, are really good for lining up against early drops in the format right now, but this is also fantastically good on turns where you're going off, quote-unquote, with Risen Reef, you know? This is actually an elemental you can draw, play, and attack with on the same turn, which really matters if you've got, say, you know, a creeping Trailblazer out, or even the 4 mana Chandra that gives a sort of anthem effect to all of your elementals. It can be really important to both draw, play, and attack, well, all 3 with this, on the same turn. So just another reason to have a haste creature. This is a lot better than it looks. I mean, look how big Waverly's gotten. It's crazy. You're a huge, sweet, beautiful baby. Kisses from my baby. Anyway, what's next? Oh yeah, Living Twister. This actually finishes off the elementals in the deck. Are you already done? Are you already gone? Nah, you'll get more comfortable with being a star. This is on my sleepers list when it first came out, and I knew it would eventually find some kind of home, but I felt like that deck would be more of a lands matter kind of deck, although you could argue that this kind of is. I've already said that there are going to be turns where we flood games, where we flood out, mostly because Risen Reef is going to hit on a lot of lands, sometimes more than we'd like. Well, this is even more flood protection for us, because it allows us to return those lands to our hand and then use them as reach or removal, and that's going to be really, really important. Not only is this a pretty stout creature that brick walls a lot of aggro decks in the early game, but it's also going to be an interactive element in the later and mid game, and that's a really important thing to have for this deck. Now, the deck plays a total of 10 Planeswalkers, which is more than you probably would have thought when you first put the deck together, but it turns out that we need at least half of these, and the other half really, really service our game plan. So let's go ahead and start with the one that I think we need the most, 3 mana Chandra. We're playing 3 copies of this. First of all, there are a total of 7 Chandras in the deck altogether, so that first ability actually really important some of the time, but very often we're going to be using the second ability. 0 to put out 2 elementals actually pressures Planeswalkers pretty well just by itself. That's not bad against control decks, but this is also really good if you have any anthem effects whatsoever out, like a creeping Trailblazer, and insanely dumb the turn after a Risen Reef, obviously. And if you have more than 1 Risen Reef out, obviously you get a buttload of triggers from just this 0 ability, like this gameplay footage is showing right now. Oh yeah, and she can just cast a Lightning Strike out of the graveyard sometimes, which is going to be really important on occasion too, either for just finishing the game off, that'll happen, or you just take out a creature and get through with your team. You'd be surprised how often an extra Lightning Strike can be the difference between victory and defeat, but for the most part, we're using this 0 ability to generate lots and lots of card advantage. Now, I'm also playing 2 copies of 4 mana Chandra, a card I was not excited about playing. I wasn't ready to think that we even needed this card. I was just going to try it out in a few matches, and it turned out it definitely pulls its weight. First of all, the +1 ability, the +2/+0 to all elementals you control, is sometimes just going to win you the game outright, especially on long turns where you start playing a bunch of creatures. A few of them have haste, your Lightning Stormkins and such. You just get through for a ton of damage literally out of nowhere when you started with almost no board when you untap that turn. I mean, just that +1 ability can lead to out-of-nowhere wins, but the ability to produce more mana is also very, very important a lot of the time for keeping your turns going. Getting that double red in the cost of a 3 mana Chandra, for instance, this can be important for too. Getting a Living Twister down, this can be important for. There's a lot of reasons why you want 2 red mana, but especially to extend those Risen Reef going off turns, 2 extra mana out of nowhere is really, really nice. This can effectively just cost 2 mana if you have enough mana to play it, and you just expect to -1 at that turn. It's really nice, and even the ability to shock stuff is nice too. It's good to have cards like Living Twister and this Chandra that function as both removal and elemental payoffs or land payoffs or whatever. So this does so many different things that it surprises me, but it is definitely worth the 4 mana price tag. And of course, Mama Chandra. We're going to play 2 copies of Awakened Inferno here, and there have been many people saying this is the worst card in the deck. And I don't disagree with them, but I don't want to go down to 0 copies. I think you might be able to get away with 1, I do, but this can come down and really save your bacon in the late game, or even the mid game, depending on how quickly you've been able to get some mana together. Again, it happens pretty fast some of the time in this deck, so you can play Chandra ahead of schedule some of the time, kill the biggest thing on their side of the board, and she's good for that. Trust me, this deck has a hard time dealing with things that are like 4 and 5 toughness sometimes, especially before you get to the lava coils on the board. So Chandra can just be your only hope against like 5 toughness or 5 loyalty planeswalkers some of the time. So do keep that in mind. You need her for that much. She's also just insanely good against slow roll decks. Things like Esper, you're always going to resolve her against and at least get 1 emblem out. And that means that Esper can't just dirtle for the rest of the game and still win. They're going to take at least 1 damage every turn. It's actually better than you think against Esper. Same thing's true of these Nexus decks. This is specifically very, very good against them because, again, even if you give them 1 emblem, they cannot just take infinite turns at that point until they somehow run you out of cards or win off a Jace or whatever they're doing nowadays. They have to actually finish the game instead of taking 20 turns because they'll die to a Chandra emblem if they do that. This is also, though, pretty good against aggro decks. You get it down and it's going to kill pretty much every aggro creature aside from your elementals, and sometimes that's just a one-sided board wipe. So that's pretty sweet. Literally everything the card does, you'll find a use for, but the floor on it is often, when you do have the ability to play her in the mid to late game, she's going to come down, spend all of our loyalty killing 1 big thing, and you just spent 6 mana on a removal spell. That doesn't feel good, but you'll still use her in that capacity, and she's important in that capacity. When she's really, really good is when you're using the second ability to just blow up everything and get in with your elementals. That said, you can always find something to do with 6 mana Chandra, so she should go in the deck. Now, we're also playing 3 copies of Nyssa, Who Shakes the World, to finish off the Planeswalkers here. Now, there's been a lot of debate on how important this card actually is for the deck. The current build only plays 10 forests, and I would debate that the less forests you play, the less desirable a card like Nyssa is. But she is still very important for the deck. Again, we need all the mana we can possibly have access to in a deck like this, especially when you're trying to play the longest turn you possibly can. So just her ability to untap a regular land, not even a forest, just a land, and get extra mana that way, really important. Plus she makes elementals. Now, keep in mind, making a land into an elemental won't trigger Risen Reef, but it will do stuff like, make Omnath deal more damage when you eventually play it. Your lands get bonuses from 4 mana Chandra and Creeping Trailblazer, and that'll be really important some of the time. Some people have mistaken this deck as a Nyssa deck, and they filled it with Lionel Elves and Paradise Druids and stuff in the early game to try to get her on turn 3, and I really don't think that that's necessary, but I do think that she's a great sort of mid-range button. If our initial game plan didn't go through the way we wanted to, you play a Nyssa, and everything seems right with the world, almost no matter what the board state is. There's a few cards left over in the deck in sort of the other category, and we're going to save 2 of these slots for a couple of copies of Hydroid Crisis. Now, the more I play this deck, the less convinced I am that we absolutely need this card. Very often, how I win, at least, is just getting through a bunch of creatures after a big long turn, going off with Risen Reef, or maybe 2 copies of Risen Reef in play. You play a bunch of creatures, and you untap the next turn, and you just go. You're able to hit them with a bunch of creatures, boosted by, 4 mana Chandras plus 1 or whatever, and you just win the game that way. Again, very often, like 80% of my wins have come from doing that, or just by Nyssa. But that said, every now and again you'll come across a creature or a planeswalker that you really need a big creature of your own, especially flyers, to deal with, Especially, for that matter, other Hydroid Crises. This can play really well against. Even though we only have 10 forests in the deck, we still produce a buttload of mana, Nyssa or not. And in the late game, it can be really nice to just play one huge flying trample threat that either stacks up to their big flying threat, or just ends the game in the air. If going wide hasn't answered the problem, the solution might just be going tall. Hydroid Crisis is really good at doing that, while also drawing a bunch of cards and getting us right back in the game against one of our worst matchups, mono red. Life is important too. But to finish it up, we're going to play 2 copies of Shock and 3 copies of Lightning Strike. Now, a lot of these decks that I've seen so far in the early going this season haven't played really almost any interaction in the form of spells. There have been some decks that have gone all the way and not played any spells whatsoever. I think that's foolhardy because I want at least a little bit of extra value off of 3 Manish Chandra, and again, the ability to play one of these spells out of the graveyard is going to be important on a lot of turns. But I just think these are important early game plays to have, and they feel important a lot of the time, not only for cleaning up early game creatures, but also like cleaning up Planeswalkers. Sometimes that Teferi will come down and go down to 1 loyalty, at which point a Shock or a Lightning Strike is a very nice thing to have. And yeah, I get the argument that like Living Twister and 4 Mana Chandra and even 6 Mana Chandra are all like on-board removal. It's focused around activated abilities, so in a way, we don't even have to play interaction. Well, that's kind of an argument, but we really need early game interaction a lot of the time in this deck. Like, just look at this game, where we were able to Lightning Strike this runaway Steamkin, and then on the next turn play Living Twister to invalidate this Get to Lava Runner. Living Twister is good at that, by the way, and invalidates almost everything in the mono red deck, and they can't kill it. But on the next turn, we're able to play Omnath, deal 2 damage to the Get to Lava Runner, and actually force a scoop out of the opponent. These early game removal spells are very important for setting up your eventual mid-range game plan. Now, we're on 25 lands in this deck right now. There are 17 green sources, 15 red, and 14 blue. And honestly, I feel like that could be improved upon. If I'm telling you the truth, and I definitely should, I think we could probably lose a green source and pick up both a red and blue source. So I think there maybe should be another Sulfur Falls or something in the deck. But as it's gone so far, this mana base has been more than serviceable for me. Now let's take a look at the board real quick, and honestly my board is very similar to a lot of other people's sideboards that I've seen for this deck so far. Veil of Summer is a nutso card. This thing is crazy. It just gives you card advantage and basically counters a spell, either a removal spell or even a counter spell some of the time. So just absolutely insane card in the right matchup, and usually that right matchup is Esper. We've got more than just that against the Esper decks, though. There's also Fry in there, which will take out both Teferis as if we weren't already good against them, but also Narset, Nicol Bolas, Lyra Dawnbringer, the odd Tempest Djinn here or there. There's a lot that Fry takes out, but there's also Lava Coil. We need this against creature-based decks when we know they're playing a bunch of creatures. Lava Coil will often come in over Lightning Strike, and even a couple of other cards here and there. Sometimes it's that important for creature-based matchups like Mono Red that you put this card in after game 1. But there's also 4 whole copies of Negate. This will protect your Omnath, your Walkers, sometimes even your Risen Reef because you want to keep it out. It'll counter Sweepers, which again we're a little soft to, counter Planeswalkers, counter the Elder Spell. There's a ton of reasons why you might want Negate. And there's a few like kind of soft slots in this deck if you haven't noticed, and I think Negate might actually deserve a one-of main deck slot because of all the things it does that the deck wants to do. But we've also got the 2 copies of Vivian Reed in the board. This kills big flyers that we're not very good against, but it'll also kill the odd enchantment, provide a little card advantage here or there, but mostly we want this against Hydroid Crisis, Lyra Dawnbringers, Sepharas, and all kinds of other nonsense. Now that's my build of the deck, but I promised I'd go over some things that some other people are doing. Now the most popular thing I've seen so far, when looking at this deck online at least, is the Wild Growth Walker package. Now, of course, Wild Growth Walker is an elemental, but neither Merfolk Branchwalker nor Jadelight Ranger are. And honestly, I feel like Risen Reef is just a better version of Explorer anyway, and honestly, Branchwalker and Jadelight Ranger just kind of cut into any elemental synergy that we could have, and to make matters worse, you're not even going to be able to play with these cards in a few months. They're going to rotate out, and I want to play as few cards that rotate as possible, especially outside of the land base. So I decided not to play these cards. We've been playing with Wild Growth Walker for 2 years almost at this point, and honestly, I could live without it. We're about to have to be forced to do so anyways, so I just wanted to build this deck without the Wild Growth Walker package, because I've got a lot of reasons why I don't care for it right now. Another thing I've seen a lot of is sort of a ramp-based Temur Elementals deck. It usually enlists the help of a lot of different 2-drops. You'll either see Paradise Druid or Chandra's Embercat or Firecat, I forget what it's called, or I think it's called Leafkin Elemental, that one too. You'll see some version of some of these creatures in a lot of these Temur Elemental decks, and I just don't much care for it. If you were going to play Rampers, I don't blame you, but Embercat is way too low impact and doesn't produce blue or green, which you'll very often need. Same thing with Leafkin Elemental. It doesn't produce the red that you'll probably need for a turn 3 Living Twister or 3 Manish Chandra. We really need double red on those turns, so I think Leafkin Elemental is right out. I don't think these are quite good enough, and I think they're just slightly too far into the cute spectrum to consider playing. I think there's better ways you can use these slots. On that same track, by the way, just a little too cute for its own good, there's the Thunderkin Awakener package. Now, I've seen a lot of people boost this thing and say that this is a good way to play this deck, and honestly, I can definitely see why. You get Thunderkin Awakener, and Multani is probably the best trick that you get with Awakener, because Multani is always 0 power when it's in your graveyard. So you can bring it back with Thunderkin when Thunderkin attacks. That seems good, and so does Runaway Steamkin. And to be honest, I've seen Runaway Steamkin in more than one build. It doesn't have to be these Awakener builds, but it's obviously a decent card to get back. Plus, like, weird stuff, the 4-mana thing that puts 3 elementals into play, so you get a bunch of Risen Reef triggers. There's cool stuff you can do with Awakener, but again, I just think it's all a little bit too cute, and there's probably better ways we could be using these slots. I'm sorry. Now, finally, there's a couple of other cards that I just don't think live up to the power level of some of the other cards in the deck, so they just don't quite make the cut. There's cards like Overgrowth Elemental, which I was really excited about playing in the first place, and Cloudkin Seer, Healer of the Glade. I think Healer of the Glade could be considerable as a sideboard slot if you're really facing a lot of mono red, either on your ladder of the arena metagame, or if you're facing a lot of mono red at FNM or whatever. I think Healer of the Glade could be a possible sideboard slot, but it's just not good enough for the deck, and we don't really want to play 1-drops anyway because we play a bunch of tap lands. And there's also Cloudkin Seer. Again, I just think things like Living Twister and 3 Manish Chandra are far better 3-drops than this card, although Cloudkin is very good, especially if you already have Risen Reef out. It's just so much card advantage. And then Overgrowth Elemental, again, super excited about playing this card, but just really low impact compared to some of our other 3-mana cards. This thing really disappointed me. I wanted it to be really good, and it's just not as good as some of the other options we're afforded in this deck. But finally, here we are with some power rankings for you, and I don't want you to freak out, but this deck scores a 70. Which is incredibly high. The only deck that's ever scored higher than that is, I believe, a Naya mid-range deck from like 3 years ago that scored a 71. That's the highest ever on the channel. But that Naya mid-range deck should teach you something. That was never an important meta deck. It was not. In that format, it was never an important meta deck, but it scored really high. So don't always take the power rankings as, total gospel or the most important thing about a deck, but it is something when a deck is able to score this high. It just doesn't do a whole lot poorly at all. And even though it can make sequencing a little bit complicated, once we do have a couple of walkers in place and a couple of key cards out, we can do almost whatever we want provided we have enough mana in the mid and late game. This deck takes extremely long turns. Let me actually show you one right here. Once you have a Risen Reef in place and a Chandra, or for that matter, a couple of Risen Reefs out, then you can just do some of the craziest stuff in the world and end up attacking for 1,000,000. Our opponent started this turn at 22. Look what happens. So that is Temur Elementals, or at least my build and a bunch of other people's builds. I tried to touch on everything I could here, but anything I missed, let me know down there in the comments section. Let me know how you felt about this first build of the season and how you built Temur Elementals. Also, if you got the time, it would really mean a lot to me if you liked the video on your way out. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done it yet. It only takes a click or two, and it helps me out tremendously. Something else that helps me out, and actually helps you out too, is just click that first link in the description down there. I'll take you over to TCG Player. Now, they help sponsor your boy. They do do give me money to say their name, but the reason that I elected to say their name is because I can truthfully tell you they're the cheapest place you're going to get this relatively expensive deck. This thing is about $400 to play in paper right now, but you can cut a few things, cut the Hydroid Crisis, cut the Vivigans from the sideboard, they rotate soon anyway, cut a couple of lands here and there, cut an Omnath, you don't need all 4 necessarily, and you're saving yourself like $150, so it's not too hard to play this deck at a reasonable price. But if you want the starting point of my list, click the first link in the description, go over to TCG Player to look at it. And of course, if you really want to support content like this a lot, then you can just click the link in the description to go to Patreon, or just put in patreon.com/SBMTG. All I ask is $1 a month, and for that $1 a month, $1 every 30 days. So I'll let you vote on what decks you want to see next, and I'll let you know what's coming a day in advance. So I try to give you something for your buck. It's a good investment. Go do it. But even if you don't, I'm just glad that you made it all the way through the video. Just the watch time helps me out enough. So appreciate all of you for sticking around. I hope you enjoyed Temur Elementals. There's a lot more where that came from. So I will catch you cats later. I'm Deb from the place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind.